I am Chloe, 33 years old, and my father secretly called every architecture firm in our state to tell them I was a thief. For over 3 years, no one would hire me. He sneered that I would end up crawling back to serve the family. From a top student, I was forced to wait tables just to keep a roof over my head. Last week, I secured a real interview. The chief executive officer walked in, studied me for a long moment, and pulled out something that made the room go silent. Before I reveal what was in that envelope, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever survived the ultimate family betrayal. The heavy doors of the private dining room felt like solid lead against my sweating palms. I balanced a silver tray loaded with 6 crystal flutes of champagne. My server uniform was stiff and smelled faintly of the deep fryer from the bustling kitchen. I took a deep breath, pushed the doors open, and stepped into the VIP suite of the city's most expensive steakhouse. There they were, the people who shared my blood. My father Richard sat at the head of the long table like a king. Next to him was my mother Patricia, dripping in diamonds. Across from them sat my younger sister Vanessa, her blonde hair cascading over a designer dress. And right at the center of attention was her husband Marcus. Marcus was a tall, handsome African-American man wearing an impeccably tailored suit. He was holding up a glass of scotch, basking in the warm glow of their adoration as they celebrated his promotion to lead project director at our family architecture firm. I kept my eyes focused on the center of the table. I just needed to deliver the champagne, clear the empty plates, and get back to the safety of the kitchen. But the moment the crystal flutes clinked against the table, the loud laughter stopped abruptly. "Well, look who we have here," Richard announced, his deep voice slicing through the festive atmosphere. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." I slowly lifted my head. My father was staring at me with a toxic mixture of cruel amusement and disgust. "I told you that you would end up exactly where you belong," Richard said loudly, making sure every person in the room could hear his insult clearly. "Serving us. That is the only job suitable for a common thief." My chest tightened painfully. "I am just doing my job," I said quietly. "Please enjoy your family celebration." Vanessa let out a mocking laugh. She leaned over and inspected my uniform with exaggerated distaste. "Oh my goodness, Chloe," she sneered. "Is that a grease stain on your apron? You smell like cheap cooking oil in desperation. Could you stand further back? You are ruining the aroma of my truffle risotto." Marcus chuckled, swirling the expensive scotch in his glass. "Come on, Vanessa. Go easy on her," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "It is honest work. Not everyone has the intellect to handle high-level architectural design. Some people are just meant to carry the drinks and wipe tables." Patricia sighed heavily and shook her head, looking at me as if I were a disgusting stain on the carpet. "It really is a tragedy," she said dramatically. "We gave you every opportunity, Chloe. We paid for your expensive education. We gave you a respected place in the family business. And how did you repay us? By trying to steal from your own blood. Now look at you. You should thank Marcus for saving the family firm when you tried to ruin it." Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp $1 bill. He held it up for a long moment, letting the entire room watch, and then intentionally dropped it onto the floor right by my scuffed black work shoes. "Pick it up," Richard commanded, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Consider it a generous tip for your excellent service tonight. Pick it up, thief." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus watched me with a victorious grin. Vanessa was barely containing her laughter. Patricia took a delicate sip of her champagne. I looked down at the dollar bill resting on the dark carpet. My heart pounded. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fiercely defend my dignity. But I did not. I maintained my composure. "Keep the dollar," I said quietly. "You are going to need it." I turned and walked out. I retreated to the service hallway, my hands trembling as I began polishing silverware near the restrooms. A few minutes later, the heavy suite doors swung open. Richard and Marcus stepped out, talking in hushed voices as they walked toward the men's room. I froze behind the service partition, hidden in the dark shadows. "I cannot believe she is actually waiting tables." Marcus laughed softly. You really broke her spirit, Richard. Of course I did, my father replied coldly. I personally called every top firm in the state. I told them she embezzled funds and stole intellectual property. No one will ever hire her. She will starve out here until she begs to come back and draft your blueprints for free. My blood ran ice cold. It was not just bad luck. My own father had actively destroyed my reputation so Marcus could continue stealing my designs. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I pulled it out. A new email notification lit up the screen. Vanguard Architecture. Final round interview invitation. I stared at the screen, a cold smile forming on my lips. I ripped off my stained apron, letting it drop to the floor. I am permanently done serving this toxic family. It is time to burn their fake empire to the ground once and for all. I am Chloe, 33 years old, and my father secretly called every architecture firm in our state to tell them I was a thief. For over 3 years, no one would hire me. He sneered that I would end up crawling back to serve the family. From a top student, I was forced to wait tables just to keep a roof over my head. Last week, I secured a real interview. The chief executive officer walked in, studied me for a long moment, and pulled out something that made the room go silent. Before I reveal what was in that envelope, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever survived the ultimate family betrayal. The heavy dining room doors felt like solid lead against my sweating palms. I balanced a tray loaded with 6 crystal flutes of champagne. My server uniform was stiff and smelled faintly of the deep fryer. I took a deep breath, pushed the doors open, and stepped into the VIP suite. Those who shared my blood. My father Richard sat at the head of the long table like a king. Next to him was my mother Patricia, dripping in diamonds. Across from them sat my younger sister Vanessa, her blonde hair cascading over a designer dress. And right at the center of attention was her husband Marcus. Marcus was a tall, handsome African-American man wearing an impeccably tailored suit. He was holding up a glass of scotch, basking in the warm glow of their adoration as they celebrated his promotion to lead project director at our family architecture firm. I kept my eyes focused on the center of the table. I just needed to deliver the champagne, clear the empty plates, and get back to the safety of the kitchen. But the moment the crystal flutes clinked against the table, the loud laughter stopped abruptly. "Well, look who we have here," Richard announced, his deep voice slicing through the festive atmosphere. "Look at me when I am speaking to you." I slowly lifted my head. My father was staring at me with a toxic mixture of cruel amusement and disgust. "I told you that you would end up exactly where you belong," Richard said loudly, making sure every person in the room could hear his insult clearly. "Serving us. That is the only job suitable for a common thief." My chest tightened painfully. "I am just doing my job," I said quietly. "Please enjoy your family celebration." Vanessa let out a mocking laugh. She leaned over and inspected my uniform with exaggerated distaste. "Oh my goodness, Chloe," she sneered. "Is that a grease stain on your apron? You smell like cheap cooking oil in desperation. Could you stand further back? You are ruining the aroma of my truffle risotto." Marcus chuckled, swirling the expensive scotch in his glass. "Come on, Vanessa. Go easy on her," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "It is honest work. Not everyone has the intellect to handle high-level architectural design. Some people are just meant to carry the drinks and wipe dirty tables." Patricia sighed heavily and shook her head, looking at me as if I were a disgusting stain on the carpet. "It really is a tragedy," she said dramatically. "We gave you every opportunity, Chloe. We paid for your expensive education. We gave you a respected place in the family business. And how did you repay us? By trying to steal from your own blood. Now look at you. You should thank Marcus for saving the family firm when you tried to ruin it." Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp $1 bill. He held it up for a long moment, letting the entire room watch, and then intentionally dropped it onto the floor, right by my scuffed black work shoes. "Pick it up," Richard commanded, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Consider it a generous tip for your excellent service tonight. Pick it up, thief." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus watched me with a victorious grin. Vanessa was barely containing her laughter. Patricia took a delicate sip of her champagne. I looked down at the dollar bill resting on the dark carpet. My heart pounded. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fiercely defend my dignity. But I did not. I maintained my composure. "Keep the dollar," I said quietly. "You are going to need it." I turned and walked out. I retreated to the service hallway, my hands trembling as I began polishing silverware near the restrooms. A few minutes later, the heavy suite doors swung open. Richard and Marcus stepped out talking in hushed voices as they walked toward the men's room. I froze behind the service partition hidden in the dark shadows. "I cannot believe she is actually waiting tables." Marcus laughed softly. "You really broke her spirit, Richard." "Of course I did," my father replied coldly. "I personally called every top firm in the state. I told them she embezzled funds and stole intellectual property. No one will ever hire her. She will starve out here until she begs to come back and draft your blueprints for free." My blood ran ice cold. It was not just bad luck. My own father had actively destroyed my reputation so Marcus could continue stealing my designs. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. I pulled it out. A new email notification lit up the screen. Vanguard Architecture. Final round interview invitation. I stared at the bright screen, a cold smile forming on my lips. I ripped off my stained apron, letting it drop down to the hard floor. I am permanently done serving this truly toxic family. It is time to fully burn their fake empire to the ground once and for all without showing a single ounce of mercy or any regret. I stared at the discarded apron on the floor, my chest heaving, as the gravity of my father's confession echoed in my ears. For 3 agonizing years I had blamed myself. I had spent countless nights crying into my pillow, wondering why my portfolio was never good enough, why every promising interview suddenly turned into a cold rejection. I had questioned my sanity, my talent, and my worth. Now the ugly truth was laid bare in the sterile lighting of a restaurant service hallway. I was not a failure. I was a victim of a calculated, systematic execution by the very man who was supposed to protect me. Richard had weaponized his industry connections to starve his own daughter, all to feed the ego of his golden child and her fraudulent husband. I looked down at my phone again. Vanguard Architecture. The name alone carried immense weight. They were the apex predators of the architectural world, the only firm that consistently outbid and outperformed my father's company. An invitation to their final round was not just a job opportunity. It was a loaded weapon handed directly to me. A sudden surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins, burning away the last remnants of the obedient, terrified girl they had molded me to be. I reached down and picked up the grease-stained apron from the tile floor. I was not going to leave it hiding in a back hallway. If I was going to sever these ties, I was going to do it in the spotlight. I clenched the coarse fabric in my fist, squared my shoulders, and turned back toward the VIP suite. Inside the private dining room, the celebration was reaching a fever pitch. Richard and Marcus had returned from the men's room, taking their seats with the relaxed posture of men who believed they owned the world. Vanessa was holding up her champagne flute, demanding everyone's attention for a toast. Patricia was gazing at her with sickening adoration. I did not knock. I kicked the heavy oak doors open with enough force to make them slam against the walls. The sudden noise shattered their perfect tableau. Vanessa gasped, spilling champagne down the front of her designer dress. Marcus jumped, his smug smile vanishing instantly. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard bellowed, rising from his chair. "I told you to get out of our sight. I am calling your manager right now and having you thrown out on the street." I ignored his shouting. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the head of the table. The heavy silence in the room was only broken by the sound of my scuffed work shoes against the hardwood floor. I did not look like a broken waitress anymore. I held my head high, making direct, unwavering eye contact with the man who had tried to destroy my life. When I reached his chair, I did not hesitate. I slammed the grease-stained apron directly onto his plate of expensive truffle risotto. The dark oil smeared across the pristine white china, splattering onto his silk tie. Patricia shrieked, clutching her pearl necklace in horror. Richard stared at the ruined meal, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. Marcus stood up, pointing a threatening finger at me. "Have you lost your mind?" Marcus yelled. "You are going to pay for that, you crazy waitress!" I slowly turned my gaze to my brother-in-law. "You should be careful how you speak to the person whose brain you have been mining for years, Marcus. You can wear all the tailored suits you want, but you and I both know you cannot draft a complex load-bearing structure to save your own life. Enjoy the promotion tonight. It is the last one you will ever get on my back." Marcus swallowed hard, taking a sudden step back. The bravado melted from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He knew I was absolutely right. Vanessa slammed her hands on the table. "How dare you speak to my husband that way?" she screamed. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter dropout. You are a thief." I leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the table, and looked directly into my father's eyes. "The only thief in this room is you, Richard." I spoke the words softly, but they cut through the quiet room like shattered glass. "I heard what you said in the hallway just now. I know about the phone calls. I know you deliberately blacklisted me at every architecture firm in the state just to starve me into submission." Richard's face drained of color. The furious patriarch routine completely evaporated, leaving behind a brief naked look of pure guilt. "You have no proof of anything," he sputtered, his voice suddenly lacking its usual thunder. "I do not need proof for what I am about to do," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "You thought you could bury me in the dark so your precious son-in-law could shine. You thought breaking my spirit would make me crawl back to you. But all you did was teach me how to survive without your money." I pulled my phone from my pocket and held the bright screen up for him to see. The Vanguard architecture logo glowed brightly next to the interview confirmation. "You tried to lock me out of the industry," I said, watching his eyes widen in pure terror at the sight of his greatest rival's name. "But you forgot that Vanguard does not care about your petty alliances. Tomorrow morning I walk into their headquarters, and when I sit down with their executive team, I am not just going to show them my portfolio. I am going to show them exactly how fake your entire empire really is." Patricia started to cry, reaching out a trembling hand. "Chloe, please do not do this to the family. We can talk about this. We can fix it." "There is no family here," I said, stepping away from her outstretched hand. "There is only a sinking ship, and I am the iceberg." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for Richard to recover his voice. I did not listen to Vanessa's hysterical screaming or Marcus's panicked stammering. I simply walked out of the VIP room, leaving the heavy doors wide open behind me so the entire restaurant could witness their utter humiliation. I pushed through the main exit and stepped out into the night. A cold, driving rain had begun to fall, washing the smell of the restaurant kitchen from my clothes. I stood on the sidewalk and tilted my head back, letting the freezing drops hit my face. For the first time in 3 years, I felt incredibly light. The heavy chains of their expectations, their abuse, and their toxic manipulation were completely shattered. I began walking down the slick, wet pavement toward the subway station. Tomorrow I would walk into Vanguard architecture. Tomorrow the real war would begin, and I was going to win. The morning sun glared off the towering glass facade of the Vanguard architecture headquarters. I stood on the pristine concrete plaza, adjusting the collar of my charcoal gray blazer. It was the only professional suit I had managed to keep pristine over the last 3 years, wrapped carefully in plastic at the back of my tiny closet. The rain from last night was gone, leaving behind a sharp, biting chill in the air. I took one deep breath, letting the crisp wind fill my lungs, and walked through the revolving doors. The Vanguard lobby was a masterpiece of modern brutalism. Soaring ceilings, exposed steel beams, and polished black marble floors created an atmosphere of absolute authority. This was not just a building, it was a statement of power. I approached the sleek reception desk, gave my name, and was immediately escorted to the 42nd floor. The elevator ride was silent, my stomach tightening with every passing second. I had no illusions about what was waiting for me. I was walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but my portfolio and the truth. The doors opened to a sprawling executive suite. An assistant led me down a long hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms, stopping at the very last door. I stepped inside. The room was freezing both in temperature and atmosphere. Sitting across a massive obsidian table were three senior directors of human resources. Their faces were entirely unreadable, their postures rigid. There were no welcoming smiles, no polite offers of coffee or water. They stared at me as if I were a biohazard they had been forced to inspect. "Please take a seat," the lead director, a severe woman with tightly pulled back hair, instructed sharply. Her nameplate read Victoria Vance, though I already knew who she was. She was known in the industry as the gatekeeper of Vanguard. I sat down, placing my leather portfolio on the smooth surface of the table. I kept my posture impeccably straight, refusing to show even a hint of intimidation. "We will get straight to the point," Chloe Victoria began, folding her hands over a manila folder. "Your initial application bypassed our standard screening process due to a high score on the anonymous technical assessment. However, when we conducted our standard background checks yesterday, a significant red flag emerged." The man to her right, a bald executive with cold gray eyes, leaned forward. "We received a highly disturbing phone call from the president of your former employer, your father, Richard. He informed us that your departure from the family firm was not a voluntary resignation. He stated explicitly that you were terminated for gross professional misconduct." The third director, a younger woman with sharp features, added the final blow: "Embezzlement of company funds and the theft of proprietary intellectual property. Those are severe accusations. In this industry, trust and integrity are paramount. We handle multi-million-dollar government contracts. We cannot employ a thief." The word hung in the freezing air, heavy and suffocating. A thief. Richard had truly burned every bridge, making sure the poison spread to the highest echelons of the city. I felt a brief flash of the old panic, the urge to shrink away and hide, but the memory of Marcus smirking in that VIP room anchored me. I channeled every ounce of my anger into pure, icy focus. "I understand your concern," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "However, those accusations are entirely fabricated. They are the desperate actions of a man terrified of his own impending obsolescence." Victoria raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by my defiance. "Fabricated? That is a bold claim against a respected industry veteran. Why would a father actively try to destroy his own daughter's career because he is protecting the real thief?" I answered without missing a beat. "My brother-in-law Marcus was promoted last night. The designs that earned him that promotion were drafted by me. My father blacklisted me to ensure I could never compete against his golden boy. He wanted to starve me out of the industry, so I would have no choice but to return and serve them in secret." The bald executive scoffed, shaking his head. "We deal in facts, not family melodrama. You have no proof of these claims. All we have is your word against the president of a major firm. From a risk management perspective, you are an absolute liability." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or plead for their understanding. Instead, I reached for my leather portfolio, unzipped it, and slid a stack of complex, highly detailed architectural blueprints across the obsidian table. "You deal in facts," I stated firmly. "Then let us look at the facts. Open those blueprints." Victoria hesitated, then pulled the stack toward her. The other two directors leaned in. I had provided the raw structural schematics for a sustainable high-rise project, a concept entirely my own. "Look at the load-bearing distribution on page 4, I instructed, taking absolute command of the room. "Notice how the kinetic stress is dispersed through the external lattice rather than the central core. It reduces raw material usage by 30% while increasing wind resistance." Marcus submitted a severely flawed version of this exact concept for a commercial bid last year. He failed because he did not understand the underlying mathematical algorithm required to stabilize the tension points. The directors stared at the complex diagrams. I did not give them a moment to breathe. I launched into a relentless high-level technical breakdown. I detailed the exact mathematical equations required for the kinetic lattice. I explained the integration of sustainable geothermal heating systems within the foundational slab. I pointed out microscopic flaws in current industry standards and provided immediate actionable solutions that Vanguard could implement tomorrow. I spoke with the authority of a seasoned master architect, dissecting every inch of structural engineering with flawless precision. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, I dominated the room. The bald executive picked up one of the schematics, his cold eyes widening slightly as he traced the intricate lines of my design. The younger director frantically took notes, clearly recognizing the revolutionary nature of the kinetic stress distribution I had just outlined. Even Victoria Vance, the ultimate gatekeeper, sat in stunned silence, her severe expression cracking to reveal a glimpse of genuine awe. I finished my technical breakdown, neatly folded my hands on the table, and looked at each of them. "A thief does not understand the math," I said quietly. "A thief only knows how to copy the picture. I am the architect. I am the creator." The heavy silence returned to the conference room, but the texture of it had fundamentally changed. It was no longer filled with immediate dismissal. It was filled with intense, conflicted hesitation. They saw the undeniable genius in front of them. They knew my designs were light years ahead of anything Richard or Marcus could ever hope to produce. Yet the atmosphere remained incredibly cold. Victoria slowly closed the portfolio, her face hardening once again into an impenetrable mask of corporate protocol. "Your technical knowledge is undeniably profound, Chloe," Victoria said, her voice measuring every syllable. "These designs are brilliant. But brilliance does not negate legal liability. If we hire you, Richard will file an injunction. He will drag Vanguard into a prolonged, messy litigation over intellectual property rights. We cannot risk a public scandal no matter how talented you are." The bald executive nodded in agreement, pushing the blueprints back across the table toward me. "You are a genius," he admitted grimly. "But you are a radioactive genius. We simply cannot touch you." I stared at the blueprints, a bitter knot forming in my throat. I had fought with everything I had. I had laid my entire intellect bare, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the rightful owner of my mind. But the corporate machine was too rigid, too terrified of Richard's legal threats to take a chance on me. I was backed into an impossible corner, suffocated by a lie I could not legally disprove. The room was freezing. The rejection was imminent. I reached out to zip up my portfolio, preparing to walk away defeated, when the heavy glass doors behind me suddenly clicked open. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the marble floor. Everything was about to change permanently today. The heavy glass doors swung wide open with a sharp click that commanded instant attention. A woman strode into the conference room, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with the rhythmic cadence of a predator. This was Julianne, the formidable chief executive officer of Vanguard Architecture. She was an industry legend, a woman who had shattered the glass ceiling with a sledgehammer to build her own empire. She wore an emerald green pantsuit that radiated absolute authority. Her silver hair was cropped in an asymmetrical bob, framing a face sculpted from ice. Her piercing green eyes locked onto mine for a fraction of a second before sweeping over the three human resources directors sitting frozen at the obsidian table. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantaneously, the air freezing before suddenly became electrified. Victoria Vance, the supposedly impenetrable gatekeeper, immediately stood up, her severe expression replaced by pure panic. The bald executive scrambled to sit up straighter, nearly knocking over his water glass in his haste. The younger director lowered her eyes, looking terrified to even breathe in her presence. Julianne did not offer a polite greeting. She did not ask for a status update on my interview. Instead, she walked directly to the head of the obsidian table, holding a thick red manila folder. With an aggressive motion, she slammed the folder down onto the hard surface. The loud smack echoed off the glass walls like a gunshot, making all three directors flinch. "I see we are having an interesting conversation this morning," Julianne said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried a lethal edge that demanded total silence. Victoria swallowed hard, finding her voice with obvious difficulty. "Madam CEO, we were just concluding our final round interview. We have reviewed her technical assessment and portfolio. We were explaining company policy regarding her employment viability." "Her employment viability?" Julianne repeated, tasting the words as if they were poisonous. And pray tell Victoria, what exactly have you determined about her viability? The bald executive nervously tugged at his collar to support his colleague. We received a direct communication from the president of her former firm, her father Richard. He informed us she was terminated for gross professional misconduct, including embezzlement and intellectual property theft. Given our strict risk management protocols, hiring her presents an unacceptable legal liability. He threatened to file a massive injunction if we bring her on board. We cannot expose Vanguard to toxic litigation. Julianne did not blink. She placed her manicured hand flat on top of the red folder. I know exactly what Richard threatened, she said, her voice dangerously smooth. I know because Richard did not just call human resources yesterday. He called my private cell phone at 6 a.m. this morning. A jolt of shock ran through my body. My father had bypassed the corporate switchboard entirely. He had been so terrified of my potential success, so desperate to keep me starved and locked out of the industry, that he had personally hunted down the private number of his biggest corporate rival just to destroy me. He was not just trying to block an interview. He was trying to completely erase my existence. He was practically hyperventilating into the phone. Julianne continued, looking directly at me. He told me that if I let you step foot inside this building, he would unleash a legal war that would tie up Vanguard in the courts for a decade. He said you were a manipulative thief who stole his proprietary algorithms. He said you were unstable, a massive corporate risk, and an absolute failure. She paused, letting the devastating weight of those lies settle over the room. The three directors nodded in unison, clearly feeling validated. We agree completely, Madam CEO, Victoria said quickly. Her designs are brilliant, but the legal threat from her father is simply too high. We were just about to show her the door. Julianne slowly turned her head back to Victoria. The look on her face was devoid of warmth. I did not ask for your agreement, Victoria, Julianne said sharply, and I certainly did not authorize you to show anyone the door. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Julianne tapped her fingernail against the red folder. When a man like Richard calls me at dawn screaming threats and demanding I reject a candidate, I do not blindly obey. I ask myself one simple question. What is he so absolutely terrified of? She looked at the executives. Your job is risk management. My job is winning. You are letting the empty threats of a desperate, mediocre architect dictate the future of my company. Madam CEO, the bald executive stammered, we are only trying to protect Vanguard from a public scandal. You are protecting Vanguard from innovation, Julianne fired back with absolute authority. I reviewed the technical assessment scores before I walked in here. I saw the raw data. I saw the kinetic load-bearing mathematics she submitted. No one in your department could even comprehend the math, let alone create it. You are willing to throw away a generational talent because a frantic old man made a phone call. The interview portion of this morning is officially over. You three are going to leave. Right now. Clear the room. The Human Resources Director stared in disbelief. One sharp warning glare from Julianne silenced any protests. They scrambled to gather their notes and tablets, practically tripping over each other in their haste. Within seconds, they hurried out the glass doors, pulling them shut with a soft click. The massive conference room was suddenly completely quiet. The suffocating corporate protocol had evaporated. I sat perfectly still at the obsidian table, my hands folded over my leather portfolio. Julianne remained standing in the quiet room. The severe mask she wore for her subordinates completely melted away. She let out a long sigh and looked at me as someone who understood exactly what I was going through. Everything was changing right now today. Julianne turned away from the obsidian table and walked slowly toward the far wall of the executive suite. The panoramic view of the city skyline framed her silhouette. She pressed her palm against a sleek wooden panel. A biometric scanner chirped, and the mahogany panel slid open with a soft hum to reveal a concealed steel safe built directly into the wall. I sat perfectly still, tracking her every movement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had expected a hostile interview or a brutal rejection. I had not expected the powerful chief executive officer of Vanguard Architecture to open a hidden vault in the middle of our meeting. Julianne spun the dial. The heavy steel door clicked open. She reached inside and withdrew something flat and rectangular. When she turned back to face me, I saw exactly what she was holding. It was an old, heavily yellowed envelope. The thick parchment paper looked ancient compared to the modern glass surrounding us. A dark red wax seal stamped with an intricate crest held the flap shut. Julianne walked back to the conference table and sat down across from me. She placed the weathered envelope on the smooth surface, sliding it to the center. She did not let go immediately. Her fingers lingered on the textured paper, her severe expression softening into something nostalgic and sorrowful. I recognized that red wax seal instantly. A jolt of electricity shot down my spine. The breath caught in my throat. I knew that crest perfectly. I had seen it pressed into handwritten letters and birthday cards when I was a little girl. It belonged to my grandmother. My grandmother Evelyn was the founder of our original family firm. She was a legendary pioneer in the architectural world, a woman who built towering skyscrapers while raising a family in a hostile, male-dominated industry. She died exactly 17 years ago. I was only 16 when she passed away. After her sudden death, Richard seized control of the company, erasing her legacy to build his own fake empire. Julianne looked at my shocked expression and gave a slow, knowing nod. "You recognize the seal," Julianne said quietly. "I am not surprised. Evelyn was a force of nature. She was my greatest mentor, my fiercest protector, and the only reason I survived my years in this brutal industry. When everyone else tried to crush my ambition, your grandmother taught me how to fight back and win." I stared at the envelope, my mind racing through disconnected memories. My grandmother Evelyn was the only person in my family who ever truly loved me. She was the one who bought me my first drafting table. She sat beside me late at night, teaching me the complex structural mathematics that Richard claimed were a complete waste of time for a young girl. "Why do you have something belonging to my grandmother?" I asked quietly. Julianne leaned forward, her green eyes locking onto mine. 17 years ago, just weeks before she passed away, Evelyn called me to her private hospital room. She was incredibly weak, but her mind was sharper than ever. She knew exactly what kind of man your father was. She knew Richard lacked the talent required to sustain the firm she had built from the ground up. She saw the greed festering in his soul, and she saw the generational genius burning inside you. A hot tear pricked the corner of my eye, but I refused to let it fall. I remained focused on Julianne. "Evelyn handed me this envelope." Julianne continued, her tone filled with reverence. "She made me swear a solemn oath. She told me to lock this away in my personal vault and never speak a single word about its existence to anyone. She gave me one specific, unbreakable instruction regarding when to bring it out into the light." "What was the instruction?" I asked, my chest aching with anxious anticipation. Julianne pushed the yellowed envelope across the obsidian table until it rested directly in front of my hands. "Your grandmother told me to wait until Richard finally crossed the line," Julianne said, her voice dropping to a fierce pitch. "She said to keep it hidden safely until the day Richard actively tried to destroy your life. She knew his massive ego would eventually perceive your brilliant mind as a lethal threat. She told me to open the vault only when Richard pushed you to the absolute edge of destruction, when he tried to starve you out and leave you with nothing. That day is today, Chloe. He made the fatal mistake of calling me this morning to brag about ruining your career. He triggered the trap your grandmother set for him almost 2 decades ago." My hands trembled as I reached out and touched the coarse parchment. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of 17 years of hidden truth. My grandmother had known everything. She had seen the impending betrayal before I was even old enough to understand the dark dynamics of my own family. She had used her final days to weave a protective safety net, placing it in the hands of the most powerful rival Richard would ever face. I stared at the dark red wax seal. It was perfectly preserved, holding secrets that had waited patiently in the dark while I suffered through years of abuse, manipulation, and poverty. I thought about the grease-stained apron I threw on Richard's plate the night before. I thought about the starvation and rejection I had endured simply because my father cruelly branded me a thief. I did not wait another second. I pressed my thumb against the heavy wax seal. I pushed down hard, feeling the brittle material snap and break apart under my forceful grip. The loud crack echoed through the silent conference room. I ripped the flap open, reached inside the weathered paper, and prepared to pull out the contents that would finally bring Richard's stolen empire crashing down. I reached inside the torn envelope and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. The top layer consisted of heavy bond paper completely covered in dense legal text and gold-embossed seals. I smoothed the pages flat against the obsidian table, my eyes scanning the bold print at the top of the first document. Vanguard Architecture Shareholder Certificates. My name, Chloe, was printed clearly across the primary beneficiary line. I stared at the percentage listed next to my name, the breath catching painfully in my tight throat. This was not a minor financial investment. It was a massive controlling block of equity in the most powerful architectural firm in the state. I looked up at Julianne in absolute disbelief. "How is this possible?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Your grandmother was a visionary," Julianne replied, a fierce smile touching her lips. When she realized Richard was going to run her beloved legacy into the ground, she began liquidating her private assets. She quietly purchased shares in Vanguard through anonymous shell companies. She knew I would eventually become the chief executive officer, and she wanted to ensure that when the time was right, you would have the ultimate leverage over your father. You are not just a desperate candidate sitting in my conference room, Chloe. You are one of my largest shareholders. My hands shook uncontrollably as I moved the heavy certificates aside to reveal the second item hidden deep in the envelope. It was a thick bundle of original vellum drafting paper, yellowed at the edges, but perfectly preserved. The moment I carefully unfolded the top sheet, a wave of profound nausea washed over me, chilling my blood. I recognized the intricate pencil strokes immediately. I recognized the precise geometric angles, the complex structural calculations written neatly in the margins, and the specific shading technique I had developed when I was just a teenager sitting at the old drafting table my grandmother bought me. I was looking at my own sketches. I was looking at the exact blueprints I had painstakingly drawn when I was only 16 years old. But these were not just random teenage doodles. The first blueprint was a highly detailed schematic for the Apex Tower, the flagship commercial high-rise that had single-handedly catapulted my father's firm to statewide dominance 10 years ago. I quickly flipped to the next page. It was the structural design for the Echo Plaza, the award-winning cultural center that Marcus had supposedly designed entirely by himself just 2 years ago, the very project that had earned him his massive promotion to lead director last night. The horrifying truth hit me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Every single major architectural triumph that Richard proudly claimed as his own was stolen. Every prestigious award Marcus paraded around the industry was a complete and utter lie. They had not just stolen my recent concepts, they had systematically raided my childhood notebooks. My father had built his entire multi-million-dollar real estate empire on the stolen imagination of his 16-year-old daughter. He had locked me out of the industry, branded me a thief to every employer, and forced me to wait tables in grease-stained aprons, all while he and his golden son-in-law lived like absolute kings off my stolen teenage homework. I flipped the delicate vellum sheets over. Stamped clearly on the back of every single page were official federal copyright seals. The dates on the dark blue registration stamps matched the exact year of my grandmother's death. Evelyn had quietly taken my sketchbooks, officially copyrighted every single design under my legal name, and locked them safely away in this vault before Richard could ever claim legal ownership. "They are frauds!" I whispered, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of absolute disgust and rising fury. My father is nothing but a parasite. Marcus is a hollow shell. They built their entire lives on my back. Julianne leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. "Richard is a parasite who thought he could silence his host," she said, her green eyes blazing with intense corporate ruthlessness. "He called me this morning expecting me to throw you out on the street. He expects you to break under the pressure. He wants you to crawl back to his office begging for a minimum wage drafting job so he can continue sucking the genius out of your brain to feed Marcus. He thinks he has completely won the game. I stared at the copyrighted blueprints. The terrified, obedient girl who had cried over rejected job applications was completely dead. The woman sitting at the obsidian table was a major shareholder of a corporate titan armed with undeniable proof of massive intellectual property theft. "So we give him exactly what he wants," Julianne said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, predatory whisper. "I am officially offering you the position of Senior Creative Director at Vanguard Architecture. But your first assignment will not take place within these walls. Your first assignment is to burn Richard's fake empire to the ground. We are going to expose him. We are going to expose Marcus. We are going to take back every single thing they stole from you." I looked at Julianne, absorbing the magnitude of her offer. The plan was brilliant, cruel, and absolutely necessary. I carefully folded my teenage blueprints and placed them back inside the heavy envelope along with the shareholder certificates. I slid the envelope across the table toward Julianne, trusting her to lock my grandmother's weapons safely back inside the vault until the perfect moment. "I accept the position," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "But I cannot just walk in and hand this over to the police today. If I sue them right now, Richard will drag it out in court for years. He will hide assets and manipulate the media narrative. I want them to destroy themselves on a public stage where they cannot possibly hide. I want to watch them lose everything in front of the entire city." Julianne smiled, a genuine expression of predatory approval. "How do we start the fire?" "We use a Trojan horse," I replied, standing up from the table. "Richard wants me to crawl back. I will crawl back tomorrow morning. I will play the defeated, broken daughter. I will beg for a job as a lowly assistant to Marcus. I will let them think they have completely broken me. And then I will build them a trap they cannot possibly resist stealing." The morning rain washed the city streets in a dull gray, perfectly matching the defeated persona I needed to project. I walked through the towering glass doors of my father's firm, letting my shoulders slump and keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. The lobby walls were lined with framed photographs of award-winning buildings. My buildings. My stolen teenage designs proudly displaying my father's signature in the bottom corner. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and approached the receptionist's desk. Within minutes, I was escorted to the top floor. I stood outside Richard's massive corner office, took one last deep breath to center my performance, and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The scene inside was sickeningly predictable. Richard sat behind his custom mahogany desk, a smug smile plastered across his face. Marcus was leaning casually against the large floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping from a mug of expensive coffee. Vanessa was lounging on the white leather sofa in the corner, scrolling through her phone while swinging a designer high heel. They looked like royalty presiding over their kingdom. They looked like predators waiting for a wounded animal to finally collapse. "Well, look who decided to show her face in daylight," Richard sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "Did you get lost on your way to another waitressing shift?" I kept my head slightly bowed, forcing my hands to tremble just enough to look authentic. "I went to Vanguard Architecture yesterday," I said, keeping my voice small and wavering. "I had a final round interview for a senior position." The room went dead silent. Marcus stopped sipping his coffee. Vanessa looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing with sudden anxiety. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "You went to Vanguard," Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I let a few seconds of heavy silence pass before I delivered the lie they desperately needed to hear. "They threw me out," I whispered, staring down at my scuffed shoes. "The human resources directors said I was a legal liability. They said no corporate firm in the city would ever touch a thief. They told me my career was permanently over." The tension in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a wave of intoxicating relief and cruel triumph. Richard let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He slammed his hand onto his desk, absolutely delighted. I told you, Richard boasted, pointing a thick finger at me. I told you exactly what would happen when you try to bite the hand that feeds you. The architectural world is a very small place, Chloe. Did you really think you could just waltz into my biggest rival's headquarters and pretend you are some kind of genius? You are nothing without this family. You are a liability. You are a failure. Vanessa tossed her phone onto the sofa and stood up, walking slowly toward me with a vicious smirk. You really thought you were better than us, did you not? She mocked, circling me like a shark. You thought dropping out of our lives and hiding away would make you special. But look at you now. You look pathetic. You have absolutely nothing. Marcus stepped away from the window, adjusting his immaculate Tom Ford suit. He placed a hand gently on Vanessa's shoulder, playing the role of the benevolent peacekeeper. Now, Vanessa, we should not kick her when she is already down, Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. She learned her lesson the hard way. The corporate world is brutal. It requires real talent, real leadership, and a spotless reputation. Things she obviously lacks. I forced myself to look up at Marcus, putting every ounce of fake desperation into my eyes. Please, I begged, letting my voice crack perfectly. I have no money left. I cannot pay my rent next month. I cannot go back to wiping grease off restaurant tables. Please, Dad, just give me a job. Any job. I will do whatever you want. Richard steepled his fingers, staring at me with cold, calculating eyes. He was savoring every single second of my total humiliation. He was feeding on my manufactured despair. You want a job here? Richard asked slowly. After you humiliated us at the restaurant last night? After you threw your dirty apron on my dinner? You expect me to just welcome you back with open arms? I will do the grunt work, I pleaded, taking a small step forward. I will stay in the back drafting room. I will not talk to clients. I just need a paycheck. Please. Richard looked at Marcus. The two men exchanged a silent, greedy look. They both knew exactly why I was useful. They needed my brain. They just needed it properly leashed and completely broken. Marcus walked over to Richard's desk and picked up a thick, glossy folder. He tossed it carelessly onto the coffee table in front of me. We just received the bidding packet for the City Civic Center, Marcus announced proudly. It is a $500 million government contract. It will be the defining architectural achievement of this decade. I am the lead director on the project, but I am incredibly busy managing the client relationships and executive meetings. I need someone to handle the tedious, mindless drafting work. Richard nodded. Here is my only offer, Chloe. You will be hired as a junior drafting assistant reporting directly to Marcus. You will work for minimum wage. You will sign a strict non-disclosure agreement stating that all designs you produce belong entirely to Marcus. You get no credit. You get no title. Take it or walk out that door and starve. I looked at the folder. The City Civic Center. A $500 million project. It was the perfect stage. I slowly reached out and picked it up. I accept, I whispered. The Trojan horse was now inside. The next morning, I arrived at the family firm wearing a simple understated blouse and slacks, keeping my expensive Vanguard suit locked away at home. The drafting room was exactly as I remembered it from 3 years ago, sterile, overly air-conditioned, and smelling faintly of blueprint ink and stale coffee. I was assigned to a cramped desk in the far corner, practically hidden behind a large filing cabinet. It was the perfect vantage point for my operation. My first task as a junior drafting assistant was to organize Marcus's scattered notes for the Civic Center project. He handed me a stack of papers that looked like they had been scribbled on during a turbulent taxi ride. The concepts were chaotic, lacking any real structural cohesion or innovative flair. Marcus was a smooth talker and a brilliant networker, but his actual architectural talent was painfully average. He relied entirely on visual flash over structural substance. Here you go, Chloe, Marcus said, dropping the messy stack onto my small desk. I need these rough ideas translated into proper schematics by tomorrow morning. Do not try to get creative. Just follow my notes exactly as I wrote them. And get me a double espresso while you are at it. I smiled meekly, playing my part to perfection. Of course, Marcus. I will get right on it. As soon as he walked away, I quickly scanned his notes. They were worse than I thought. If he submitted these designs to the city council, the building would not just look uninspired, it would barely pass basic safety regulations. I began drafting, carefully correcting his structural flaws while maintaining the superficial aesthetics he requested. I made sure the initial sketches looked competent, but deliberately kept them generic enough that he could easily claim them as his own work. The abuse escalated rapidly over the next 2 weeks. Marcus treated me like a personal servant, ordering me to fetch his lunch, organize his calendar, and draft endless revisions of his mediocre ideas. He never once acknowledged my input. During a staff meeting, I watched him confidently present my corrected schematics as his own brilliant problem-solving, basking in the applause from the junior architects. He did not even glance in my direction. Vanessa was equally insufferable. She visited the office almost daily, treating the company headquarters like her personal shopping lounge. She would parade through the drafting room carrying bags from designer boutiques, loudly complaining about how exhausted she was from spending so much money. "Oh, Chloe, you are still wearing those cheap slacks," Vanessa commented one afternoon, leaning against my desk while applying a fresh coat of expensive lipstick. "You really need to upgrade your wardrobe. Marcus just got his project bonus early, so I picked up some amazing pieces. Maybe I can give you my old clothes when I clean out my closet next month." I kept my eyes focused on my computer screen, biting my tongue to keep from unleashing my fury. "That would be very generous of you, Vanessa," I said softly. Patricia was perhaps the most toxic element of my daily existence. My mother made a point of stopping by my small desk every time she visited the office, ensuring I understood exactly how grateful I needed to be for my humiliating position. She would place a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder, her voice dripping with artificial maternal concern. "We are so glad you finally saw reason, Chloe," Patricia said, patting me condescendingly. "Richard and I were so worried about you working in those terrible restaurants. You really owe Marcus a massive debt of gratitude for bringing you onto his team. Not many lead directors would take a chance on a dropout with your kind of history. You need to work hard and show him you appreciate this second chance." Her gaslighting was relentless. She completely ignored the fact that my father had actively destroyed my reputation, framing my return as an act of immense family charity. Every interaction was designed to keep me feeling small, indebted, and utterly dependent on their supposed goodwill. I absorbed every insult, every condescending remark, and every stolen design with cold, calculating patience. I was a sponge soaking up their arrogance, storing it away for the final reckoning. During the day, I played the broken, grateful assistant. But late at night, long after the office had emptied out and the cleaning staff had gone home, I stayed behind. I sat alone in the silent drafting room, illuminated only by the glow of my computer monitor, and I began crafting my masterpiece. The City Civic Center was a monumental undertaking. It required a design that was not just aesthetically breathtaking, but structurally revolutionary. The city was looking for a landmark that would redefine the downtown skyline, something that balanced modern innovation with sustainable engineering. Marcus's notes were nowhere near capable of winning a $500 million bid, so I built something that would absolutely guarantee a win. I designed a sweeping, asymmetrical structure that utilized a groundbreaking kinetic tension distribution system. It was bold, visionary, and mathematically complex. I poured every ounce of my true talent into the digital blueprints, crafting a design that would undeniably blow every other competing firm out of the water. But I did not just build a beautiful building, I built a highly sophisticated trap. The entire structural integrity of my visionary design relied on a central load-bearing pillar. To the naked eye, or to an average architect like Marcus, the pillar looked like a standard, albeit elegant, support structure. But hidden deep within the mathematical algorithms, calculating the kinetic stress, I embedded a fatal flaw. The math was incredibly dense, layered with advanced calculus that I had learned from studying my grandmother's private journals. If you simply looked at the digital rendering, the building appeared perfectly stable. But if you were challenged to explain the structural load distribution, you would need to know the specific hidden equation that balanced the entire system. Without that specific equation, the math appeared to suggest the building would collapse under its own weight within 5 years. I meticulously hid the solution. I made the flaw virtually invisible to anyone who did not intimately understand the advanced architectural theory behind it. Marcus would never spot it. He would look at the stunning visual renderings, see the guarantee of a $500 million victory, and eagerly claim the entire project as his own undisputed genius. He would never bother to check the underlying math because he lacked the capability to understand it in the first place. The Trojan horse was fully constructed. The bait was set. Now I just needed Marcus to take the fatal bite. To ensure the trap was absolutely irresistible, I needed the visual presentation of the City Civic Center to be the most breathtaking architectural achievement this city had ever seen. I spent the next 3 nights operating on zero sleep, fueled entirely by black coffee and the icy anticipation of my impending revenge. It was a crystalline monument to innovation. I designed a sprawling central atrium enclosed by a massive glass canopy. The structure mimicked the natural curves of the river, integrating lush green spaces directly into the urban core. Natural light flooded the interior, bouncing off sleek titanium accents. It was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering that screamed absolute prestige. I knew when Marcus laid his eyes on the digital renderings, his massive ego would override any caution. He would look at this glass palace and see his face on the cover of every architectural magazine. He would practically salivate. But the true genius of my design was not in the sweeping glass or the titanium accents. It was buried deep within the core structural pillars supporting that massive floating canopy. In architecture, load-bearing distribution follows strict mathematical principles. Too much weight on a central point causes catastrophic fractures. To support my sweeping glass canopy, I drafted spiraling, ultra-thin pillars. To a mediocre architect like Marcus, they looked like a stroke of structural brilliance. They appeared to defy gravity, offering maximum support with minimal visual obstruction. I embedded a highly complex fake load, bearing mathematical algorithm into the foundational blueprints. I used a recursive geometric progression from my grandmother Evelyn's old journals. On paper, the math looked incredibly dense. It gave the illusion that kinetic tension from the massive glass roof was perfectly dispersed downward into the bedrock. Marcus would look at the advanced calculus and simply assume it was the work of a competent subordinate handling boring technical details. The math was a carefully constructed lie. Any master architect or seasoned civil engineer who scrutinized the algorithm closely would eventually hit a massive, terrifying dead end. The geometric progression created a phantom shear stress point at the absolute center of the canopy. According to the visible math, the first major winter storm would cause the entire glass roof to violently shatter and collapse inward. There was only one way to prove the building was safe. The presenting architect had to verbally provide a specific unwritten counterbalance coefficient. It was a secondary equation that offset the phantom stress point, essentially proving that the kinetic tension was being safely redirected into the lateral support beams. That equation existed only inside my head. Without it, the design was a beautiful, spectacular death trap. I spent Friday morning preparing the final presentation files. I rendered the 3D models in stunning high definition, making sure the lighting caught every elegant curve of the glass canopy. I printed a stack of glossy full-color presentation boards and left them sitting casually on the edge of my cramped desk. I then opened the master CAD files on my dual monitors, ensuring the highly complex fake structural algorithms were displayed prominently on the screens. The bait was fully prepared. Now I just needed to watch the rats circle the trap. Throughout the afternoon, the atmosphere in the firm grew incredibly tense. The deadline for the city council bid was approaching rapidly. Marcus was pacing the floor outside Richard's office, barking aggressively at junior designers, and desperately trying to cobble together a cohesive presentation from his chaotic notes. He was sweating, his custom-tailored suit looking wrinkled and uncomfortable. He knew his ideas were garbage. He knew he was about to walk into a $500 million bidding war armed with nothing but mediocrity. Around 3 o'clock, I saw him walking briskly past the drafting room. He paused, his eyes catching the glossy presentation board sitting on my desk. I kept my head down, pretending to be deeply engrossed in organizing a stack of invoices. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him slowly step backward, his gaze locked onto the breathtaking 3D renderings of the Civic Center. His mouth parted slightly. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a ravenous, consuming greed. He took a step toward my desk, his eyes darting quickly across the room to ensure no one else was watching. He leaned over, his gaze sweeping across my dual monitors, taking in the dense, sophisticated mathematical algorithms I had left on display. I could practically see the greedy gears turning in his head. He had found his golden ticket. Chloe Marcus said suddenly, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Are these the rough drafts I asked you to put together?" I looked up, offering him a meek, obedient smile. "Yes, Marcus. I followed your notes exactly as you requested. I just tried to clean up the structural mathematics to ensure everything met city safety codes. I hope it is what you were looking for." Marcus stared at the brilliant, revolutionary design that he had absolutely no hand in creating. He swallowed hard, a slick, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "Yes," he murmured, his eyes never leaving the screens. "Yes, this is exactly what I envisioned." "Excellent job transcribing my vision, Chloe. You can go home early today. Leave the files open. I need to review my work before the weekend." I nodded dutifully. "Thank you, Marcus. Have a wonderful weekend." I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked toward the exit. My heart hammered a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. I had given him the keys to his own destruction. I stepped into the elevator, pulled out my phone, and accessed the hidden application I had installed earlier that week. A live video feed from the drafting room security camera popped up on my screen. I tapped the record button, leaned back against the cool metal wall of the elevator, and waited for the show to begin. The elevator descended smoothly, but my eyes remained glued to the glowing screen of my smartphone. Through the hacked feed of the drafting room security camera, I watched the office slowly empty out for the weekend. The junior architects packed up their bags, switched off their desk lamps, and headed for the elevators. Within an hour, the sprawling room was entirely deserted, bathed in the dim blue hum of emergency lighting. Except for my corner. I had deliberately disabled the sleep mode on my dual monitors. They glowed like twin beacons in the dark, displaying the breathtaking structural renderings of the City Civic Center. I stepped out of the building and walked down the rain-slicked street, ducking into a quiet coffee shop across the avenue. I ordered a black coffee, sat in a secluded booth, and kept my eyes locked on the live surveillance feed streaming directly into my encrypted cloud server. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 6:45, the heavy glass doors of the drafting department pushed open. Marcus stepped into the frame. He was completely alone. He paused at the entrance, his head swiveling from side to side, ensuring the room was completely abandoned. The overhead emergency lights caught the sharp cut of his expensive tailored suit, but his usual arrogant swagger was entirely missing. He looked frantic. He looked like a desperate man grasping for a lifeline. He loosened his silk tie, pulling it down with a rough jerk, and unbuttoned his collar. He wiped a layer of nervous sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He took a cautious step forward, then another, his leather shoes making no sound on the carpet as he crept toward my desk. Watching him skulk through the shadows like a common burglar filled me with a deep, intoxicating sense of vindication. This was the golden boy my father had chosen over me. This was the architectural genius of the family, sneaking around in the dark to scavenge off the plate of his minimum wage assistant. Marcus reached my desk and stood before the dual monitors. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, casting harsh shadows across his features. I zoomed in on the camera feed, capturing his expression in high definition. His jaw dropped slightly as he navigated through the complex three-dimensional models. He was mesmerized by the sweeping glass canopy and intricate kinetic pillars. He had no idea what he was looking at mathematically, but he knew instantly that this design was an absolute masterpiece. It was his guaranteed victory. His hands hovered over the keyboard. For a split second, I wondered if he felt any guilt. But Marcus was a parasite, and parasites only know how to feed. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. He jammed it into the port of my computer workstation. A small window popped up on the screen, reflecting in the glass of the window behind him. File transfer initiated. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. Marcus stood rigidly, shifting his weight from foot to foot, constantly checking over his shoulder. The sweat was gleaming on his forehead, now dripping down the side of his face. He wiped it away nervously, terrified that the janitorial staff or a lingering executive might walk in and catch him red-handed. He was stealing $500 million worth of intellectual property, and he was sweating through his designer clothes to do it. The progress bar reached 100%. The files were successfully copied onto his drive. But Marcus was not finished. He needed to ensure there was no trace of my original authorship. He needed to completely erase me from the narrative, just as my family had been doing for my entire life. He grabbed the mouse and navigated to the local directory where my files were stored. With a few rapid clicks, he highlighted the entire project folder. He did not just send it to the recycling bin, he permanently wiped the original documents from the hard drive, executing a hard delete that purged the files from the local server. He was actively destroying my work to cover his tracks. Then he opened the copied file on his flash drive. He navigated to the master title block positioned at the bottom right corner of the primary blueprint. My initials were listed in small print under the drafting assistant section. Marcus highlighted my name and hit the backspace key. He erased my existence with a single keystroke. In my place, he typed his own name in bold capital letters. Lead, Project Director Marcus. To seal the theft, he uploaded his secure digital signature file and stamped it directly onto the title block, legally claiming full ownership of the entire design. He pulled the flash drive from the port and slipped it safely into his jacket pocket. He let out a massive, shuddering breath, a visible wave of relief washing over his entire body. He smiled, a sickeningly smug expression that contorted his handsome features. He thought he committed the perfect crime. He closed out the remaining windows and turned off my monitors, plunging my corner of the office into total darkness. What Marcus did not realize was that his digital signature was not the only thing being stamped tonight. My cloud server was silently logging every single keystroke he made. It captured the exact timestamp of the file transfer. It logged the precise moment of the deletion. It recorded his facial recognition data from the camera feed, clearly tying him to the physical act of corporate espionage. I had him trapped in a digital cage of his own making. The trap was now fully armed, waiting for him to pull the trigger. I finished my black coffee, stood up, and walked out into the chilly night air. The first phase of my revenge was flawlessly complete. Marcus had just sealed his doom. 2 weeks later, the night of the City Council bidding gala finally arrived. The city spared absolutely no expense for the unveiling of the $500 million Civic Center project. The event was held at the Grand Symphony Hall, a sprawling architectural marvel of white marble and towering glass arcades. A massive red carpet stretched from the curb all the way up the grand staircase, flanked on both sides by velvet ropes, aggressive flashing cameras, and eager local reporters. The entire architectural elite of the state had gathered to witness the crowning of the next industry titan. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume-aged scotch and naked ambition. My family arrived in a fleet of black town cars, stepping out into the blinding glare of the paparazzi flashes. Richard emerged first, wearing a custom tuxedo that barely concealed his swollen ego. He waved to the cameras with the practiced ease of a politician, soaking in the flashing lights as if they were his birthright. Patricia followed close behind him, draped in a shimmering silver gown and a diamond necklace that caught the camera flashes brilliantly. She clung to Richard's arm, projecting the ultimate image of the loyal matriarch. Then came the golden couple. Marcus stepped out of the second town car, adjusting his cufflinks with sickening self-assurance. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket that screamed absolute arrogance. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had already won the $500 million lottery. Vanessa hung off his arm, wearing a scarlet silk dress that left very little to the imagination. She was practically vibrating with greed, her eyes scanning the crowd to make sure everyone was properly admiring her successful, brilliant husband. I arrived in a separate, much cheaper rideshare vehicle. I was wearing my plain black blazer and sensible flat shoes, completely blending into the background. As my family gathered at the base of the red carpet to pose for the local architectural magazines, I quietly approached them from behind. I was holding two massive, incredibly heavy presentation portfolios containing the physical manifestation of my stolen genius. Richard glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of me. His plastic smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, disgusted frown. He grabbed Marcus by the elbow and pulled him back a few steps out of range of the nearest microphones. "What took you so long?" Richard hissed at me, keeping his voice dangerously low so the reporters would not hear. "The presentation starts in less than an hour. If you drop those boards, I will make sure you never find a job cleaning toilets in this city again." Marcus sneered, looking down at my simple black blazer. "You are not walking up the red carpet looking like that, Chloe. You look like a caterer. There is a service elevator around the back of the building near the loading dock. Take the presentation boards up through the service entrance and wait in the staging area behind the main curtain. Do not let any of the council members see you. We need to project absolute perfection tonight, and you are a complete eyesore." Vanessa laughed, a sharp grating sound that cut through the ambient noise of the crowd. "Try not to get lost in the basement, Chloe. Just put the boards on the easels and stay completely out of sight. Tonight is Marcus's night to shine. Do not ruin it with your depressing energy." I adjusted my grip on the heavy leather handles of the presentation portfolios. The thick straps dug painfully into my palms, but I did not let a single ounce of frustration show on my face. I bowed my head submissively, playing my role one last time. "Of course, Marcus," I said softly. "I will take the service elevator. Good luck out there tonight." I turned away from the blinding camera flashes and walked down the dark alleyway toward the loading dock. The damp smell of the dumpsters and the flickering yellow light of the service entrance were a stark contrast to the glamour of the red carpet. But as I carried the massive portfolios into the rusted metal box of the service elevator, I was not feeling humiliated. I was feeling an overwhelming sense of electric anticipation. They thought they were banishing me to the shadows. They had no idea they were simply giving me the perfect cover to orchestrate their total destruction. The service elevator jolted upward, rattling and groaning as it carried me toward the main ballroom level. Inside my blazer pocket, my phone buzzed lightly. I pulled it out and read a single text message from Julianne. "We are in position, awaiting your signal." I smiled, sliding the phone back into my pocket. The doors clanked open, revealing the chaotic behind-the-scenes staging area of the grand ballroom. Technicians were rushing around with clipboards, adjusting lighting rigs and testing the massive audio systems. I walked confidently past them, navigating the narrow corridors, until I reached the heavy velvet curtains that separated the staging area from the main event space. I carefully set the presentation boards down on the designated display easels right next to the curtain opening. I unzipped the leather cases and arranged the breathtaking visual renderings of the Civic Center. The sweeping glass canopy, the intricate kinetic pillars. The beautiful deadly trap was now fully assembled and placed right on the edge of the stage. I peeked through a small gap in the heavy velvet curtains. The ballroom was magnificent. Hundreds of tables covered in white silk filled the massive space. The city council members sat at a raised platform at the very front, their faces serious and expectant. Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa had already taken their seats at the prime VIP table, located dead center in the front row. They were sipping expensive champagne, laughing loudly, and shaking hands with city officials. Marcus stood confidently nearby, smiling at the council. Perfect. I stepped back from the heavy velvet curtain and let it fall shut. Marcus was in position. The trap was set. Now it was my turn to take the stage. I slipped away from the display easels, walking briskly down a dimly lit side corridor that bypassed the main kitchen. Julianne had secured a private green room for me on the opposite side of the concert hall. I pushed the door open and found a sleek garment bag hanging from a velvet rack right next to a pair of designer stilettos. I stripped off the cheap, oversized black blazer that smelled of public transit and subservience. I kicked off the sensible flat shoes that marked me as a servant. In their place, I put on the armor of a conqueror. It was a custom-tailored crimson pantsuit cut with razor-sharp lines that screamed power and absolute authority. The fabric felt like a second skin. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, unforgiving style and applied a bold, dark red lipstick. When I looked in the full-length mirror, the broken, fearful assistant was entirely eradicated. I looked like a woman who owned the building. I looked like the architect of their destruction. I stepped out of the green room and found Julianne waiting for me in the grand foyer. She looked me up and down, a fierce, predatory smile spreading across her icy features. "You look exactly like your grandmother, Julianne," said her voice, echoing slightly in the vast marble hall. "Are you ready to take back your skyline?" I adjusted my cuffs and met her gaze with total, unwavering certainty. "I am ready to take absolutely everything," I replied. The muffled sounds of the gala filtered through the massive brass-studded double doors leading into the main ballroom. The city mayor was approaching the podium to deliver the opening remarks. The room was buzzing with the low hum of hundreds of conversations, the clinking of expensive crystal, and the shuffling of the architectural elite preparing for the bloodbath of the bidding war. Julianne nodded to the two security guards flanking the entrance. They grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled the doors wide open. The sudden rush of bright light and the loud creak of the hinges instantly drew the attention of the entire room. The low hum of conversation snapped into a sudden, breathless silence. Julianne was an industry titan. Her arrival always demanded total respect. But as we stepped through the threshold and began walking down the center aisle, the collective gaze of the ballroom shifted entirely to me. I matched Julianne stride for stride, my stilettos clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The sea of faces parted for us. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, spreading like wildfire across the elegant tables. People recognized me. They remembered the cruel rumors Richard had maliciously spread. They remembered the story of the disgraced daughter, the alleged thief who was blacklisted from every major firm in the state. Yet here I was walking side by side with the most powerful chief executive officer in the industry, wearing a suit that cost more than most of their luxury cars. I kept my chin high, my eyes fixed straight ahead, projecting an aura of completely untouchable dominance. As we neared the front of the ballroom, I finally let my gaze drop to the center VIP table. The reaction from my family was more exquisite than I could have ever imagined. Richard had been in the middle of taking a sip of his aged scotch. He froze completely, his glass hovering inches from his open mouth, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost. Patricia gasped audibly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute shock. Vanessa was staring at my custom crimson suit with a look of pure, unadulterated horror and rabid jealousy. She gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She realized instantly that my outfit eclipsed her entire wardrobe. Marcus, standing near the presentation stage preparing to deliver his stolen masterpiece, looked like he had been struck by lightning. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, completely failing to ever comprehend how his lowly assistant had bypassed security and allied herself with his ultimate enemy. Julianne guided me directly past their table without offering them a single glance. She led me to the Vanguard executive table positioned prominently in the very front row right next to my family. In a deliberate, highly visible display of ultimate respect, Julianne pulled out the center chair for me. The entire room watched the legendary chief executive yield the seat of honor to the blacklisted daughter. I sat down gracefully, crossing my legs and smoothing my crimson jacket. Richard suddenly leaned across the empty space between our tables, his face turning a furious, mottled shade of purple. "Julianne, what kind of sick joke is this?" Richard hissed viciously, spit flying from his lips. Security is going to drag her out of here in handcuffs. Julianne did not even bother to turn her head or acknowledge his pathetic, desperate existence. She simply took her seat right next to me, calmly adjusting her perfectly folded silk napkin. I turned my head very slowly to face my father, fixing him with a cold, dead stare that immediately made him flinch. You should absolutely sit back down and pay very close attention to the stage, Richard, I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. You are about to witness the most expensive failure of your entire life. Before he could scream out a loud response or desperately summon building security, the city mayor tapped the microphone on the main podium, officially calling the highly prestigious bidding gala to order. This immediately forced a furious, completely paralyzed Richard to sink helplessly back into his velvet chair, trapping him in the front row for the execution. The mayor tapped the microphone, silencing the grand ballroom. Welcome to the unveiling of the proposals for the new City Civic Center. I invite the lead project director of our first presenting firm to the stage. Marcus, the floor is yours. Marcus adjusted his velvet jacket, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. He walked up the steps to the main podium, forcing a charismatic smile as applause washed over him. Avoiding the vanguard table, he fixed his gaze on the city council members. He signaled the booth, and the massive screens illuminated with the first slide of his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. The future of civic architecture is not just about concrete and steel. It is about light harmony and sustainable integration with our natural environment. Behold the new City Civic Center. He clicked the remote in his hand. The screen transitioned to the high-definition, three-dimensional rendering I had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. The sheer visual impact of the design was undeniable. The sweeping asymmetrical glass canopy looked like a frozen wave of water catching the simulated sunlight brilliantly. Lush green spaces integrated seamlessly with the urban plaza, supported by ultra-thin spiraling kinetic pillars that effortlessly defied gravity. It was a masterpiece, and Marcus was parading it as his own undisputed genius. He walked confidently across the stage, using a laser pointer to highlight the elegant titanium curves. He delivered the superficial talking points I had left in the project notes, sounding incredibly convincing to the untrained ear. The city council members were completely mesmerized. The mayor leaned forward in genuine admiration. In the front row, Richard puffed out his chest with a smug grin. Patricia clapped in silent delight, while Vanessa looked around to ensure everyone was properly jealous of her brilliant husband. For 10 agonizingly long minutes, Marcus ruled the room. Riding the wave of my stolen creativity, he believed he had already secured the $500 million contract. He clicked to the final slide, displaying the complex foundational blueprints and the intricate cross-section of the central load-bearing pillar. As you can see, Marcus proclaimed proudly, waving his hand toward the incredibly dense mathematical algorithms displayed on the massive screen. We have revolutionized the structural support system to maximize open space while maintaining absolute safety and stability. This is not just a building. It is a mathematical triumph. Thank you, Marcus. That is a truly stunning visual presentation, a deep, gravelly voice interrupted. The compliment was immediately undercut by a heavy tone of aggressive skepticism. The voice belonged to Chief Engineer David Sterling. He was a man with 40 years of structural experience and a reputation for ruthlessly dismantling flawed designs. He did not care about sweeping glass or titanium accents. He only cared about physics. He leaned forward to his microphone on the council platform, pushing his thick glasses up the bridge of his nose as he scrutinized the blueprints on the screen. However, the chief engineer continued, his eyes narrowing sharply. I am looking at the kinetic stress distribution along your primary central pillar. The geometric progression you have charted here is highly unusual. Marcus maintained his plastic smile, though a tiny bead of sweat suddenly formed at his temple. Yes, sir, Marcus replied smoothly. It is a proprietary new algorithm we developed to ensure maximum aesthetic appeal without sacrificing any load-bearing capacity. It represents the cutting edge of modern engineering. The chief engineer did not smile back. He tapped his pen against his wooden desk. Architecture is not magic, Marcus. It is physics. Looking at the calculus you have provided for the central node, all the lateral kinetic tension from that massive glass canopy is being funneled directly into a single phantom shear stress point. According to the visible math on your slide, the first major winter storm carrying heavy snow will cause the entire roof to violently shatter and collapse inward, potentially killing thousands of people. A shocked murmur erupted across the ballroom. The mayor frowned, turning his attention sharply from the pretty pictures to the serious engineer. The atmosphere in the room plummeted from awe to immediate alarm. Marcus froze completely. The charismatic smile instantly melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of absolute terror. He stared at the massive screen behind him, his eyes darting frantically across the complex equations I had planted. He had no idea what a phantom shear stress point was. He did not understand the geometric progression. He was staring at a foreign language that he was suddenly expected to translate to save his career and a $500 million contract. Sir Marcus stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. The math is completely sound. We ran several computer simulations. The lateral beams absorb the stress. Then explain the counterbalance coefficient, the chief engineer demanded loudly, his voice echoing through the silent hall. You have an incomplete equation on the board. There must be a secondary verbal equation to offset the stress point and redirect the tension into the bedrock. Explain the math to me right now. How does the central pillar not collapse under the sheer weight of the canopy? Tell this council the exact equation. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. The single bead of sweat multiplied into a torrent, pouring down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive velvet jacket. His hands began to shake so violently he dropped the laser pointer. It hit the wooden stage with a loud clatter. Absolute total panic completely consumed Marcus from the inside out. He looked trapped. In a moment of pure, desperate instinct, he looked down off the stage, his wide, terrified eyes searching the front row. He looked desperately at Richard, begging his father-in-law for salvation. Richard stared back at Marcus, his face completely devoid of answers. The patriarch who orchestrated my downfall was paralyzed in his velvet chair. He had no engineering background to save his golden boy. The silence in the grand ballroom stretched into an excruciating eternity. The local news cameras zoomed in tight on Marcus. Every drop of sweat, every panicked twitch of his eye was being broadcast to viewers across the state. Patricia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, watching her perfect son-in-law publicly self-destruct. Marcus opened his mouth again, emitting a pathetic sputtering sound. He looked back at the chief engineer, completely empty-handed. He was a hollow vessel exposed before the highest architectural authority in the city. The chief engineer leaned closer to his microphone, his expression hardening into absolute disgust. I asked you a direct question, Marcus. If you cannot explain the foundational counterbalance coefficient of your own design, then this city council has absolutely no business entrusting you with a $500 million public infrastructure project. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles shaking violently. Sir, I can have my team run the numbers and send a detailed report by tomorrow morning? He pleaded, his voice cracking horribly. The chief engineer shook his head, reaching for his gavel. A true architect does not need a team to explain the core of his own masterpiece. I did not wait another second. I pushed my chair back from the Vanguard executive table. The sharp scrape echoed loudly through the tense, silent ballroom. Every single head in the room turned toward me. I stood up, my crimson suit glowing like a warning beacon under the massive crystal chandeliers. I picked up the silver wireless microphone resting on our table. I flicked the switch, a soft electronic hum signaling that the floor was now mine. The counterbalance coefficient relies on a non-linear differential equation, I said. My voice rang out through the state-of-the-art sound system, crystal clear, entirely unwavering, and dripping with absolute authority. The murmuring instantly ceased. Marcus gasped, gripping the podium as if it were a life raft. Richard tried to stand up, but a sharp glare from a nearby security guard forced him back down. The chief engineer froze his hand, hovering right above his wooden gavel. He peered through his thick glasses at me, captivated by the sudden insertion of actual intelligence. I kept my eyes locked directly on the chief engineer, ignoring my family. I began to walk slowly toward the center aisle, commanding the attention of the entire room. To offset the phantom shear stress point at the central node, you must apply a lateral tension modifier of 0.84 to the secondary lattice structure I explained, delivering the calculus with the grace of a master. The geometric progression is not meant to push the kinetic weight downward into the bedrock. That would cause a catastrophic fracture. Instead, the algorithm dictates that the kinetic energy is dispersed horizontally across the outer titanium ribs, utilizing the natural flexibility of the glass canopy to absorb and distribute the load. I took another step forward, my stilettos clicking sharply. The mathematical proof requires integrating the wind resistance factor with the thermal expansion rate of the glass. When you apply the specific calculus, the central pillar is not carrying the full weight of the roof. It acts as a stabilizing anchor, while the outer structural ring handles 90% of the kinetic tension. The building will not collapse under a winter storm. It will actually use the external pressure to reinforce the structural integrity of the entire grid. The grand ballroom was spellbound. You could hear a pin drop. The chief engineer grabbed his pen and rapidly scribbled the numbers I had just spoken onto his notepad. For several agonizing seconds, he stared at his rapid calculations. The aggressive skepticism on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a radiant expression of pure architectural awe. He looked up from his notes, completely ignoring Marcus on the stage. He focused his entire attention on me. "That is brilliant," the chief engineer whispered directly into his microphone. "That is absolutely brilliant. The math is completely flawless. It solves the kinetic tension problem perfectly." A collective gasp of amazement rippled through the city council. The mayor leaned back in his chair, visibly impressed. The journalists frantically typed on their laptops, capturing the dramatic turning point of the gala. The chief engineer adjusted his glasses, looking at me with immense respect. "Who are you, miss? And how do you know the intimate structural mathematics of this design better than the lead project director standing on the stage?" I stopped walking. I stood dead center in the main aisle, perfectly illuminated by the spotlight. I turned my head very slowly and looked at Marcus. He was gripping the podium so hard his fingers were turning blue. Tears of absolute panic were welling in his eyes. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the blade drop. I turned my gaze away from him and looked directly up at the city council. I held the microphone close, ensuring my next words would echo through the history of this city. "My name is Chloe," I stated clearly, my voice projecting absolute dominance. "I am the senior creative director at Vanguard Architecture, and he cannot explain the math because those are my blueprints." The entire ballroom erupted. It was a massive, deafening explosion of shock, outrage, and chaos. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes blinded the room in a rapid-fire strobe effect, and the city council members began talking over one another in total disbelief. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm, my crimson suit acting as a shield against the noise. I looked at the front row. Richard was clutching his chest, his face completely pale. Patricia buried her face in her hands. Vanessa was shaking her head in rabid denial. Marcus stumbled backward on the stage, stepping away from the podium as if it had suddenly caught fire. He bumped into the digital display screen, looking wildly around the room for an escape route that did not exist. He was completely exposed, entirely ruined, and permanently branded as a fraud on live television. The firm credibility was instantly atomized. The foundation of their stolen empire had been completely obliterated in exactly 30 seconds. I lowered the microphone. The takeover was absolute. Now I finally needed to show them the hidden security footage and end everything once and for all. The uproar in the room was deafening, but a sudden sharp screech of audio feedback pierced through the chaos. Richard had leapt from his seat in the front row, snatching a microphone from the hands of a startled event coordinator standing near the VIP tables. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated desperation. The veins in his neck bulged against his tightly fastened collar as he leveled a trembling finger directly at me. Lies, Richard screamed, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art speakers, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned crowd. Do not listen to a single word this woman says. She is a disgraced, bitter former employee who was fired for gross incompetence. This is corporate espionage of the highest order. She hacked into our secure company servers. She stole Marcus's brilliant designs and memorized the mathematical formulas just to come here tonight and publicly sabotage our bid. She is a criminal and a hacker. The audience gasped, their heads swiveling back and forth between Richard and me, like spectators at a brutal tennis match. The journalists raised their cameras, hungry for the escalating drama. Marcus, emboldened by his father-in-law's aggressive defense, suddenly found his voice. He gripped the wooden edges of the podium, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to reclaim his lost authority. "Yes!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking slightly before stabilizing. "She was my junior assistant. She had unauthorized access to my terminal. I fired her just last week when I caught her snooping through my private files. She is trying to steal the credit for my life's work. Security, remove this woman immediately." Vanessa jumped up from her chair, her scarlet dress flashing under the chandeliers, and began screaming for the guards to arrest me. Patricia was weeping loudly, playing the role of the devastated mother whose business was being attacked by an unstable daughter. They were mounting a desperate united front, clinging to their fabricated reality with everything they had. I stood my ground in the center aisle, completely unfazed by their synchronized hysteria. I let them scream. I let them hurl their baseless accusations into the glaring lights. I waited until Richard ran out of breath and the ballroom fell into a tense, expectant hush. The city council members looked down at me, waiting to see how the senior creative director of Vanguard Architecture would respond to such severe allegations of corporate espionage. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults. I simply turned my gaze away from my frantic family and looked up toward the darkened balcony at the back of the symphony hall. Through the tinted glass of the audiovisual control booth, I saw the silhouette of Vanguard's lead technician. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The massive digital projector behind Marcus instantly went black. The sudden darkness on the stage caused Marcus to flinch. He looked over his shoulder just as the projector roared back to life. The screen did not show his glossy, stolen renderings. Instead, it displayed the stark, high-definition, blue-tinted footage of our family firm's drafting room. The timestamp in the bottom corner blinked clearly, showing a date from 2 weeks ago at exactly 6:45 in the evening. A collective gasp of shock rippled through the grand ballroom. On the massive screen, the heavy glass doors of the drafting department pushed open. A towering figure stepped into the frame. The high-definition camera captured the sharp cut of his expensive tailored suit, the frantic swiveling of his head, and the heavy sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. The entire city watched as Marcus crept through the shadows of the empty office, approaching my corner desk with the stealth of a common burglar. "No!" Marcus whispered into the hot microphone, his voice trembling with absolute horror. "Turn it off. Turn that screen off right now." No one moved to help him. The audiovisual feed was locked. The footage continued playing, showing Marcus pulling a silver flash drive from his jacket pocket and jamming it into my computer workstation. The screen split in half. On the left side, the video feed showed Marcus frantically looking over his shoulder. On the right side, a stark black terminal window appeared, displaying the raw, unedited forensic data logs from the company servers. My voice rang out through the ballroom, cold and commanding. "You claim I hacked your computer, Marcus. Let us look at the digital forensics." The data logs displayed on the right side of the screen were captured directly from my personal encrypted cloud server. They show exactly what happened that night. The forensic logs highlighted lines of code in bright red. The audience watched in morbid fascination as the log documented a massive file transfer from my local drive onto an external USB device. But he did not just steal my work, I continued, my voice echoing off the marble walls. He tried to erase my existence. The video on the screen showed Marcus gripping the mouse. The forensic logs simultaneously displayed the command history. Everyone in the ballroom watched the text scroll rapidly as Marcus executed a hard delete of the original project files. Then the log showed him opening the title block. The entire city council, the mayor, and hundreds of elite architects watched the live playback of my name being deleted, replaced by Marcus's bold capital letters. Finally, the screen showed the application of his digital signature. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and devastating. To eliminate any remaining doubt, I pointed to the final section of the forensic display. And for the record of authorship, I stated firmly, Vanguard Architecture's internal servers verified the metadata of these files before I accepted my position. The timestamps embedded deep within the core algorithms prove that I originated this entire project weeks before Marcus ever laid eyes on it. My digital signature is woven into the very fabric of the mathematics. The massive screen zoomed in on the Vanguard authentication certificate, displaying a creation date that predated Marcus's theft by a full month. The trap had closed perfectly. The digital guillotine had dropped, severing their lies from reality. Richard collapsed back into his velvet chair, completely broken. The fierce, aggressive patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who had just watched his entire legacy burn to ash. Marcus stood frozen on the stage, the glaring evidence of his crime illuminating his terrified face. The entire grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos as the reality of the massive corporate fraud fully settled over the crowd. Vanessa covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her husband's humiliation set in. She could no longer pretend she was married to a genius. She was married to a desperate thief who had just committed career suicide on the largest possible stage. Patricia reached for Richard's arm, but he violently shrugged her off, his eyes fixed on the screen in total despair. They had built their entire identity on an illusion of superiority, and now the entire city was watching the ugly, undeniable truth. Julianne remained seated at the Vanguard executive table, a slight predatory smile playing on her lips. She did not need to say a word. The power shift was completely finalized. Vanguard had not only secured the $500 million contract, but they had also publicly annihilated their only significant competitor without breaking a single drop of sweat. I stood tall in the center aisle, my crimson suit radiating strength. The reporters were shouting questions at Marcus, demanding explanations he could not possibly provide. The chief engineer banged his gavel, trying to restore order to the frantic city council platform. The golden boy was trapped in the glare of the projector, fully exposed, while I finally stepped entirely out of the shadows. The false empire was completely demolished. Now it was time to collect the ultimate debt from 17 years ago and deliver the final crushing blow. The chaotic din of the grand ballroom reached a deafening crescendo. Reporters hurled questions like daggers toward the stage, their camera flashes creating a relentless lightning storm. Marcus remained paralyzed behind the podium, clutching its wooden edges. Down in the front row, Richard shot up from his velvet chair. The panic that had drained the blood from his face was replaced by a frantic mask of fatherly affection. He lunged for his microphone. "Please calm down," Richard bellowed over the sound system, forcing a hearty chuckle that echoed awkwardly through the massive hall. "This is simply a monumental misunderstanding, a minor internal miscommunication. Chloe is my brilliant daughter, and she is passionate about her work. We are a family firm. Sometimes the lines of collaboration get blurred in the creative process. Marcus was merely presenting a joint family effort. We are all on the same team here. Let us not turn a spirited family dispute into a public spectacle." I stared at him, disgusted by his shameless capacity to lie. He was trying to tether his sinking ship to my rising star, hoping the council would believe this was a quirky domestic squabble. I raised my own microphone, my voice slicing through his pathetic damage control like a surgical blade. "There is no team, Richard," I stated, my words ringing with metallic precision. "And there is certainly no family. You disowned me. You starved me out of the industry. You called every major firm in this state to brand me a thief so you could keep me chained to the bottom of your drafting room floor." Richard gripped his microphone tighter. "Chloe, please," he pleaded, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We can discuss these matters at home. We do not need to involve the city council. We are flesh and blood. You are a crucial part of our legacy." "You do not have a legacy." I replied, my voice echoing across the silent ballroom. You have a crime scene, and I am the lead investigator. I reached into the inner pocket of my custom crimson suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the heavy parchment of the envelope Julianne had given me at Vanguard headquarters. The broken red wax seal crumbled against my fingertips as I pulled it out into the glaring lights. I held it high above my head, ensuring every camera lens in the room focused directly on the weathered paper. 17 years ago, I announced commanding the attention of every official and architect in the building. My grandmother Evelyn, the true founder of your company, lay dying in a hospital bed. She knew exactly what kind of man you were, Richard. She knew you lacked the talent to sustain her firm. She also knew I possessed the architectural genius you desperately craved. She knew you would try to consume me. Richard stared at the yellowed envelope, his eyes widening in pure terror. He recognized the thick parchment. He recognized the remnants of his mother's wax seal. His jaw went slack. Before he could utter a word of protest, I looked up at the audiovisual booth and gave another sharp nod. The digital projector behind Marcus instantly shifted. The forensic logs vanished, replaced by high-resolution scans of delicate yellowed vellum drafting paper. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Projected on the massive screen were the original blueprints of the Apex Tower, the flagship commercial high-rise that launched Richard's firm to dominance 10 years ago. I clicked a small remote in my hand, transitioning to the next slide. The screen displayed the structural schematics for the Echo Plaza, the award-winning cultural center Marcus claimed as his own just 2 years ago. I clicked again. The screen filled with blueprint after blueprint, displaying every major architectural triumph Richard's firm built over the last decade. Look closely at the bottom right corner of every single document on that screen, I instructed the council. The projector zoomed in on the title blocks. There, written in the neat handwriting of a 16-year-old girl, was my name, Chloe. But more devastating than my signature were the dark blue federal registration stamps pressed firmly into the back of every vellum sheet. My grandmother took my sketchbooks, I explained, my voice booming with undeniable triumph. She officially copyrighted every single one of my teenage designs under my legal name. She locked them in a private vault, instructing Vanguard's chief executive officer to release them only when you finally tried to destroy my life. Every building you have constructed in the last decade was stolen from the notebooks of a 16-year-old girl. Every award you claim, every dollar you have made, is built on intellectual property fraud. The chief engineer removed his thick glasses, vigorously rubbing his eyes. The mayor leaned forward, his expression hardening into absolute fury. The realization hit the city council and the media simultaneously. This was not a dispute over a single bid. This was a 2-decade-long corporate fraud scheme of unprecedented proportions. Richard dropped his microphone. It hit the marble floor with a loud screech of feedback. He stumbled backward, crashing into Patricia's chair. Patricia was weeping hysterically, grasping at his suit jacket, but he was entirely unresponsive. He stared at the massive screen, watching his entire life's work, his reputation and his freedom, evaporate in high definition. You called me a thief, I said, walking slowly toward the stage, my eyes locked on my trembling father. You dragged my name through the mud and tried to force me into a life of servitude. But the truth is finally out. You are not a master architect, Richard. You are just a pathetic grave robber who spent the last 17 years plundering his own daughter's mind. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and profound. I stood before the devastated remains of my family, holding the yellowed envelope that saved my life. The false empire was completely and permanently dead for all time. The profound silence hanging over the grand ballroom was abruptly shattered by the thunderous boom of the main brass doors swinging violently open. The heavy wood slammed against the marble walls with a concussive force that made the crystal chandeliers tremble overhead. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. A wall of imposing figures marched through the threshold. There were over a dozen men and women wearing sharp, dark suits, their faces set in expressions of absolute stone. The bright gold letters printed across their tactical windbreakers clearly identified them as federal agents and financial crimes investigators. They moved in a highly coordinated tactical formation down the center aisle, completely ignoring the blinding flashes of the press cameras. The crowd of elite architects and city officials instinctively parted like the Red Sea, scrambling to get out of the way of the advancing authorities. I turned slightly to look at Julianne. The Vanguard chief executive officer remained seated at her executive table, casually swirling the remaining champagne in her crystal glass. She caught my eye and offered a slow, predatory nod. She had not just forwarded my digital forensic logs to the police. She had personally coordinated this entire strike with her high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, ensuring the warrants were signed and ready to execute the very moment Marcus presented the stolen blueprints. The lead federal agent, a tall man with a stern jawline, split his team with a sharp hand signal. Half of the armed officers moved directly toward the main stage, while the other half surrounded the central VIP table, where my father remained frozen in his velvet chair. Marcus watched the agents ascending the stage stairs. His eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant golden boy, who had confidently strutted down the red carpet an hour ago, was now hyperventilating, backing away from the wooden podium until his shoulders hit the massive digital screen, still displaying his stolen algorithms. Marcus, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, wire fraud, and attempting to rig a municipal bidding process, the lead agent announced. His voice boomed across the stage, completely unbothered by the hundreds of cell phones actively recording the arrest. Put your hands behind your back immediately. Marcus shook his head frantically, his velvet tuxedo completely soaked in nervous sweat. No, he squeaked, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. There is a mistake. I am the lead director. I did not do this. It was Richard. Richard made me do it. He gave me the files. I am just following orders. Please do not do this. His cowardly attempt to throw my father under the bus to save his own skin drew gasps of disgust from the city council platform. The federal agents did not hesitate. Two officers grabbed Marcus by his arms, spinning him around and forcefully pressing him face first against the digital projector screen. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. Down in the front row, the second squad of agents closed in on my father. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He jumped to his feet, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the floor. Do you have any idea who I am? Richard roared, his face contorting into a mask of desperate fury. You cannot do this. I am a pillar of this community. I demand to call my lawyers right this instant. You are making a catastrophic mistake. A female agent stepped directly into his personal space, completely immune to his booming voice. Richard, you are being placed under federal arrest for massive intellectual property theft, embezzlement, grand larceny, and multiple counts of financial fraud spanning over 17 years, she stated with icy precision. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately. Patricia lunged forward, grabbing the agent by the sleeve of her dark suit. You cannot take my husband. Patricia wailed, her flawless silver gown wrinkling as she sobbed hysterically. We are a respectable family. My daughter is lying. She is a sick, jealous girl. She set us up. The agent sharply pulled her arm away from my mother's grasping hands. Step back, ma'am, or you will be charged with interfering with a federal investigation. Patricia stumbled backward, collapsing into the arms of a horrified city official. Vanessa was shrieking from the other side of the table, watching in absolute horror as the agents grabbed her father. Richard fought against the officers, twisting his shoulders and shouting furious threats, but he was quickly overpowered. They wrenched his arms behind his back, securing the heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. The great patriarch, the man who had terrified me for my entire life, was reduced to a struggling, pathetic criminal in front of the entire city. The brilliant facade he carefully maintained for decades shattered completely into jagged pieces on the cold marble floor. I stood perfectly still in the very center aisle, holding my grandmother's yellowed envelope in my hand. I watched as the federal agent's frog marched Marcus down the stage steps. His velvet suit was rumpled, his face buried in his chest to hide his tears from the flashing cameras. He looked exactly like the hollow fraud he had always been. The golden boy was finally facing the severe, unyielding reality of his own utter incompetence and monumental failure. They marched Richard right past me. Our eyes met for just a fleeting quiet second. I expected to see pure hatred, but instead I saw the shattered, empty gaze of a man who finally realized his reign of terror was permanently finished. He had built his entire castle on sand, and I had just summoned the raging ocean. The heavy brass doors at the back of the hall slammed shut behind them, sealing their inescapable fate. The police sirens wailed outside a triumphant symphony, marking the absolute end of their stolen empire. Inside, the chaotic energy shifted into a tense and suffocating vacuum. The council and press corps remained completely frozen in their seats, processing the monumental collapse. At the VIP table, only Vanessa and Patricia remained. They looked like desperate survivors stranded among overturned champagne glasses and discarded silk napkins. Vanessa was hyperventilating. She stared at the doors as if expecting Marcus to walk back in and declare it was a massive misunderstanding. Patricia sat slumped, her diamond necklace weighing her down. She muttered quietly, entirely unable to comprehend how her perfect world had been ripped away forever. A federal agent walked toward their table. She carried a leather binder and wore an expression of strict bureaucratic indifference. Vanessa looked up, her face twisting into arrogant indignation. "You have no right to do this to my husband," Vanessa shrieked loudly. "He is a genius. My father is a pillar of this city. We will sue the government for everything you have." The agent did not blink. She pulled out documents stamped with red seals. "You will need lawyers who work for free," the agent stated coldly. "Vanessa, I am serving you with an asset freeze. Effective immediately, every corporate account associated with your father's firm is locked. Furthermore, due to evidence that stolen funds were funneled into personal accounts, all your banking assets, investment portfolios, and credit lines have been frozen for mandatory restitution." Vanessa stared in mute horror. Frozen, she repeated the word sounding foreign to her. "You cannot freeze my personal accounts. I have nothing to do with the firm. I am a wife. Your credit cards have been used to purchase luxury goods using funds linked to intellectual property fraud," the agent explained. "Every diamond you are wearing, your car, and your mansion are now classified as stolen assets. You have absolutely nothing." Vanessa snatched her designer clutch. Her hands shook violently as she pulled out her smartphone and opened her banking application. The screen displayed a glaring red notification. "Account suspended. Contact federal authorities." She switched to her credit card application. The exact same red warning flashed across her screen. "Zero available credit." A guttural scream ripped from Vanessa's throat. She dropped the phone as if it burned her flesh. It clattered against the marble floor, the screen shattering completely. "My money!" Vanessa sobbed hysterically, dropping to her knees. "You cannot take my life away. I am a VIP." She looked pathetic. The golden child who mocked my grease-stained apron, who spent her existence looking down on everyone, was weeping uncontrollably because her limitless bank accounts were empty. Without the stolen credit cards, she was just an empty average person. Patricia watched her golden daughter unravel. The brutal reality of their financial and social ruin crashed down upon her heavily. The matriarch who had gaslighted and abused me snapped her head toward me. She saw me standing tall in my crimson suit, surrounded by the silent awe of the city's powerful people. Patricia scrambled up from her chair. She pushed past the federal agent and stumbled down the center aisle. Her silver gown caught on a chair, ripping the expensive fabric, but she did not care. She threw herself forward, collapsing at my feet. "Chloe," Patricia wailed, her voice cracking with raw desperation. She grabbed the hem of my tailored pants, mascara running down her tear-stained cheeks. "Chloe, please. You have to stop this right now. You have the power to stop this. Tell Julianne to call off the agents." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. There was no genuine maternal warmth in her eyes. There was only the frantic terror of a woman losing her stolen luxury. "Tell them to let your father go," Patricia begged, her voice rising to a pleading pitch. "We are your family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You cannot destroy us like this. Blood is thicker than water. You must remember." I stared down at her trembling hands clutching my clothes. I felt absolutely nothing. The agonizing wounds she had intentionally inflicted on my soul for 33 years were completely cauterized. I reached down and firmly pried her fingers off my crimson suit. I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to look up. Blood is thicker than water, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. That is a very convenient phrase, Mother. You did not care about my blood when you watched Richard steal my teenage designs. You did not care about my blood when you laughed while he threw a dirty $1 bill at my feet. You did not care about my blood when you let Marcus take all the credit for my architectural genius while I scrubbed dirty restaurant tables just to survive. Patricia sobbed, shaking her head violently. I did not know she pleaded lying even in her final moments. I was trying to keep the family together. I wanted to protect our legacy. You were protecting your own disgusting greed, I corrected her, my tone absolutely merciless. You knew exactly what was happening. You enabled the theft every single day. You actively celebrated my starvation because it made Vanessa look better by comparison. You built your entire lavish lifestyle by happily cannibalizing your own daughter. I looked over at Vanessa, who was still weeping loudly on the floor, clutching her shattered phone. Then I looked back down at Patricia. You should have thought of that before you made me pay for my own stolen life, I stated clearly, ensuring every single person in the grand ballroom heard my final verdict. Patricia let out a devastated wail, burying her face in her hands. There were no more cards to play. There were no more lies to spin. The elite crowd watched in silence as the once mighty family was reduced to begging and weeping on the floor. I turned my back on them and began walking confidently toward the main exit. How does the ending of Chloe's journey tie together her newfound independence and the legacy of Grandma Evelyn's envelope? My sharp stilettos clicked loudly against the polished marble floor as I approached the exit. Behind me, the chaotic symphony of my family's total destruction faded into background noise. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom and stepped out into the cool night air. The plaza was swarming with reporters, camera crews, and industry bloggers who had been tipped off by Julianne's aggressive public relations team. The moment they saw my crimson suit, the area erupted into a storm of camera flashes. Microphones were thrust toward me from every direction. Reporters shouted frantic questions about the corporate fraud, the arrests, and my sudden rise to power. I paused at the top of the grand staircase, looking out over the vast sea of eager journalists. Julianne stepped through the brass doors and stood firmly by my side, offering a silent nod of solidarity. I raised my hand, and the shouting crowd instantly died down to a hush. For 17 long years, my father tried to bury me in the dark. I stated clearly, ensuring every recording device captured my words. He stole my childhood designs, blacklisted my professional name, and handed my architectural genius to a hollow fraud. Tonight, that darkness is lifted. Vanguard Architecture has secured the Civic Center project, and it will be built exactly as I originally designed it. My name is Chloe, and I am officially taking my skyline back. I did not take any questions. I descended the stairs with Julianne and climbed into the black town car waiting at the curb. As the driver pulled away from the Symphony Hall, I looked out the tinted window at the flashing lights. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The war was officially over. Fast forward exactly 1 year. The architectural landscape of the city was completely transformed. My father's fraudulent empire was nothing but a pathetic cautionary tale taught in freshman business ethics classes. The family firm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 2 months after the bidding gala. Every single asset was seized and liquidated to pay off the massive federal fines and the restitution owed to Vanguard for decades of intellectual property theft. Richard and Marcus were stripped of their architectural licenses and completely disgraced in the public eye. They did not get the luxury of a prolonged legal defense because their stolen money was immediately frozen by the government. They both accepted heavy plea deals for federal wire fraud, bid rigging, and grand larceny. Marcus traded his expensive velvet tuxedo for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence at a medium-security federal correctional institution. Richard received a much harsher punishment. He was sentenced to 15 brutal years in a maximum security penitentiary. The great patriarch who once threw a dirty $1 bill at my feet now spends his miserable days scrubbing the concrete floors of a prison cafeteria. He will likely spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a tiny windowless cell, entirely forgotten by the world he tried to conquer. The financial ruin completely destroyed the women of the family as well. Patricia was evicted from her sprawling suburban mansion and forced to move into a tiny, rundown studio apartment on the dangerous outskirts of the city. Her diamond necklaces and designer gowns were seized and auctioned off by the federal government to pay legal fees. She spends her days entirely alone, alienated by her former high society friends who flatly refuse to associate with the disgraced wife of a convicted felon. But the most satisfying transformation belongs to my sister. Vanessa, the arrogant golden child who mocked my grease-stained apron, was completely cut off from her stolen wealth. Without Marcus's fraudulent income, she had absolutely no marketable skills and no college education to fall back on. Today, Vanessa works a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store in a dying rundown shopping mall. She spends 8 agonizing hours a day standing on her aching feet wearing a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform folding clearance shirts and enduring the endless complaints of rude customers. There are no more expensive shopping sprees or luxury sports cars. She takes the crowded public bus to work every single morning, carrying the incredibly heavy burden of her own shattered arrogance. While they dwell in the miserable ruins of their own making, my life has reached towering new heights. I am standing in the expansive penthouse of the newly constructed City Civic Center. The warm morning sunlight pours through the sweeping asymmetrical glass canopy that stretches brilliantly above my head. The kinetic structural pillars utilizing my precise mathematical algorithms support the massive roof flawlessly. The building is an absolute masterpiece, and it belongs entirely to me. My name is deeply etched into the solid bronze dedication plaque in the main lobby. As the senior creative director and a major shareholder at Vanguard Architecture, I have completely reshaped the aesthetic of this entire city. Julianne and I have turned Vanguard into an unstoppable global force, securing massive government contracts across the entire country. I walk over to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows and look out over the sprawling metropolis. The city skyline is a jagged horizon of gleaming steel and glass, and I have conquered every single inch of it. I place my hand gently against the cool window pane, thinking about my grandmother Evelyn. She knew the darkness that lived inside Richard, but she also saw the brilliant fire burning inside me. She packed away a simple yellowed envelope 17 years ago, trusting that I would eventually find the strength to use it. I did not just survive the starvation and the abuse. I took the broken pieces of my stolen life and forged them into an indestructible empire. I am no longer the terrified daughter or the subservient waitress. I am the master architect of my own destiny, and the magnificent view from the very top is absolutely breathtaking. Chloe's story teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and resilience. Often the people who should protect us are the ones who hold us back due to their own greed. However, this journey proves that your true value is never defined by the false narratives toxic family members create to diminish you. Instead of surrendering to their cruelty, she used her intellect to reclaim her stolen power and build an empire on her own terms. True independence is the ultimate revenge. Have you ever had to break free from a toxic environment to find your potential? Share your story and comment below.